Wondery Plus subscribers can binge all episodes of Ghost Story ad-free. Join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Have you ever heard about a ghost haunting not the house that something bad has happened in, but the house next door or a nearby place?
So have I heard of a house that's haunted because something's happened next door?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically spirits have got free will. So if they die in their house, but there's people next door, they might want to nip next door and see what the neighbours are doing.
If you'd asked me a year ago what I thought about people who make their living hunting ghosts, I would have said they're scam artists, or total loons, or totally loony scam artists. But people change. I mean, who wouldn't want to nip next door and see what the neighbours are doing, right? That was before I learned of the girl living in my teenage bedroom and the faceless woman who would come to her in the night. And before I met Sonia and heard about her shaking bed and whatever her sister experienced, which was so traumatic she can't talk about it all these years later. And now I found myself thinking, maybe people who spend their days hunting ghosts are exactly the people we need to talk to.
We're not scientists, by the way. Let's get that clear.
So, a few months ago, Annie and I tracked down every ghost hunter and paranormal expert we could find in the UK.
I'm curious if you perform exorcisms?
No, that's not our bag.
Where are you on the rankings of the big paranormal investigation companies?
We're at the top by far.
People who've been in the business for years and really honed their craft.
It's hard in ghost hunting because there's no degrees for this.
We all have our own different belief system. We all have our own different methods.
I'm more kind of old school, so I believe in energy levels.
We are more pragmatic. We want to go out there and do it.
How long have you been doing this for?
Together, 8 years.
Yeah, it's about 8 years now.
Yeah.
The first guys we sat down with operate as plainclothes ghost hunters.
So one of our niches is that we are one of the few groups that go into people's homes privately.
And they told us to steer clear of those they see as lesser professionals.
Keep an eye out for red flags.
The people that wear uniforms, you know, with the badges and...
Paramilitary uniforms. So that's my advice.
Too late.
Can you describe your emblem?
Yeah, okay, so the emblem, I designed the emblem.
We were already meeting with the people in the uniforms.
It's basically a replica of an American police badge.
So is there a bird at the top of the logo?
Eagle. It is an American eagle.
We even visited one of the leading manufacturers of ghost hunting equipment in the UK, a place called Spirit Shack.
How did you come up with Spirit Shack?
You know, I came up with several different ideas. Spirit Shack just sounded a little funky. And there's another company called Radio Shack that design radios.
So should we be thinking about Spirit Shack as like Radio Shack, but for spirits?
No, Radio Shack's a completely different company.
We told them each what was going on in the house on Queen's Road, my yellow vase moving around, and they had a few different theories.
Things moving is extremely rare. Like I said, that's poltergeist activity. It's extremely rare.
Several of them thought it might be a poltergeist, the kind of ghost that's trying to tell me something.
They want your attention, and they will get your attention by throwing something at you or moving something, an object you may have placed somewhere.
I believe that only a demon has the power to do something like that.
One thought my ghost might be a demon. And demons, it turns out, have a nose for the vulnerable among us.
I don't really want to say the weak-minded because I don't want to be insulting, but some people are more open to being possessed. So demons will usually pick the weakest target mentally.
The weakest target mentally? Offence taken. And lastly, another guy thought there might not be a ghost at all. Instead, he thought there might be something growing behind the wallpaper. What do you mean by mold behind the wallpaper? You're talking about like psilocybin sort of hallucinogenic mold?
Yeah.
He suspected I might have been tripping.
It
Sounds
happens,
great.
But I'm not saying that you lived in a very dirty house or anything. But unfortunately, we have to rule out everything.
Okay, well, ask me now what I make of ghost hunters, and I guess I'd say that some of them might definitely be scam artists. And no doubt, a bunch of them are a little loony. But I'd also say the best of them, they might be up to something much more interesting than I'd given them credit for.
I will look at a lot of the cases and I will think to myself, I'm not sure that there's a physical thing that's actually happening here. 95% of probably what we hear about is actually something that's being projected from the person. Psychologically, they think these things are happening.
Which isn't to say that they don't believe there are ghosts out there, poltergeists, whatever. But they're also just much more open-minded about the many ways that a person can be haunted.
People get into this feeling that they've got to find an explanation for their life and the sorry state they might end up, no money, ill health. And one of the explanations is the paranormal.
Our methods are not to go in and to make them believe in ghosts, because I believe people haunt themselves.
And apparently all you have to do to unhaunt yourself is to talk about it.
What you're actually providing is some sort of care. Being able to talk to somebody about it, you know, that old adage about a problem shared is a problem halved. I think it's very true.
Nick, what you're describing here, it sounds to me like really a kind of psychological support you're giving people.
Yeah.
Not that talking about the ghost makes it go away. Actually, none of the ghost hunters are even interested in getting rid of ghosts. But somehow acknowledging it's there takes away its power to haunt you.
You know, we're very much like, look, you guys need to live here. You know, you need to learn how to relax in this place as best you can. And through that, they feel they're not alone.
Do you feel like people misunderstand what you do?
Yeah, people do misunderstand what we do. They see us just as, you know, Ghostbusters, but we're not. We're more than that, because we're helping members of the public with traumatic experiences, things that they're going through. People are haunting themselves, and we're trying to make them unhaunt themselves, basically.
Which I guess makes you wonder.
Do you think that Tristan could be haunting himself?
No. I think he had a genuine haunting. I think you had a genuine haunting myself, because what's amazing and miraculous is how Tristan's life has panned out, that he's landed up with Kate. I believe that's fate and destiny. It's all happened for a reason.
From Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios, this is Ghost Story. I'm Tristan Redman. Episode 4, The Advantages of Believing.
Jack Darcy had just joined the British Secret Service. It's the beginning of 1915, and he's about to enter Britain's first spy school for a crash course on intelligence, which lasts just over a month. Hitherto, however, we've had little idea what the new recruits were taught, because they were strictly forbidden to take notes. Darcy disobeyed that rule.
This is a BBC documentary from 1988. The Jack Dancy they're referring to here is Father, of course. So far, we've met him as the Dancy family patriarch, but outside the family, he's also been known as one of Britain's first international secret agents.
His is the only account to come to light of training at Britain's first spy school. It's a unique record of how law-abiding English gentlemen were taught the art of unscrupulous behavior.
This documentary and the memoirs it's based on might help us understand a key question the murder detectives raised in the previous episode. They all agreed that for Father to have killed his wife and his brother-in-law, he would have to have been capable of extreme calculation and deception. So what kind of man was he? We found someone who spent a whole lot of time trying to answer exactly that question.
What are you opening here?
I'm opening a file that I kept at the time, which describes everything that happened from the first phone call, and it's labelled John Horace Darcy.
This is historian Nick Hiley. His experience nearly 40 years ago grappling with who Father was left such a mark on him that he's kept all the documentation of what happened.
Do you remember where you were when you first learned about the writings of John Dancy?
Yes, I was living in Cambridge, and I got a phone call.
Nick was working in 1987 as a young academic at Cambridge University, studying the history of British espionage, when he got a call from his colleague.
He rang me and told me about the material that had been shown to him.
The colleague had just got his hands on a rare document, a handwritten memoir of a former British spy.
I then went and picked up this suitcase full of hard-backed, lined notebooks, at least a dozen of them.
A literal suitcase.
A literal suitcase, yeah.
The suitcase was full of Feather's memoirs, the nearly 3,000-page document he wrote that now lives with my wife's uncle Mark Dancy, who we visited earlier in the series. But it wasn't just the size of the document that impressed Nick, it was the intimacy, a door being opened that had always been shut tight.
Well, I should explain what work on the history of the Secret Service was like in those days.
Yeah.
This is before any official files had been released to the National Archives.
At this point, in 1987, the British government had revealed almost nothing about the inner workings of its intelligence agencies.
So, I would still, if I went away for a research trip somewhere and came back with 5 pages of material, new material, I'd be delighted. So when I get a phone call that tells me there are thousands of pages of intimate detail, this is just astonishing. Quite unlike anything we were used to dealing with, the little puffs of steam that escaped from under the lid of the official pot. It was unprecedented. It immediately felt that this should be published.
So, Nick starts editing the memoirs down, and at the same time, he and his colleagues start collaborating with the BBC on the documentary about Feather.
What is the documentary called?
Well, the documentary, there's a piece of publicity here for it, a publicity postcard they produced. And it says, Time Watch, the diary of a very English spy.
I have been admitted into a complicated new world through locked doors. My slate has to be wiped clean of relations and old friends.
This is the 80s, so the documentary is full of slightly grandiose music and cheesy reenactments of scenes from the memoirs. But these are Feather's actual words come to life.
It will be an entirely new life, which requires me, in a sense, to change into a different person.
The film depicts a small group of well-dressed gentlemen sitting in spy school, the teacher lecturing in front of the class.
Lying is in effect our profession. You are a man of mystery, a man who knows something his enemies do not know he knows.
Hardened criminals would be brought in from prison to teach the cadets how to break into buildings and get back out again without being seen.
If properly performed, this maneuver can be done in broad daylight. You'll now have the advantage of seeing the expert do it.
Feather recounts meeting the head of the spy agency, who tells him why he's uniquely qualified to be an effective spy.
You react strongly under pressure and have a quality of alertness which I'm looking for in my men. You're also a doctor, the last person to be suspected if anything should go badly wrong.
Up until this point, historians like Nick had understood the spying business to be amateur work, patient observation, maybe photographing some documents. But what Feather describes on the eve of the First World War is an agency that's much more sinister.
Dancy's diary gives us a unique, unparalleled insight.
This is Nick, by the way, in the doco.
He talks openly about ethical liquidation, that it might be useful to incorporate murder in the new ethics of the Secret Service.
What was ethical liquidation, as you put it?
Authorizing, ordering, carrying out somebody's murder for the greater good.
Human lives are no longer to be cherished and prolonged, for they are now expendable.
Feather talks in his memoir about a particularly upsetting class in spy school, one he called the butchery class. In it, he remembers being shown how to cut a man's neck. He says the teacher, quote, showed us the precise position of the heart and of the carotid arteries in the neck, and with it, the right sort of knife with which to approach them. It was about 5 inches long, razor sharp down both edges, to give it the best start possible.
One of the striking things about the manuscript is that it's continuous and unbroken. It has this sense of omniscience. He doesn't admit anywhere to not knowing things.
Nick is bewildered by the memoir, not just the intimate window it provides into the life of a spy, but the knowingness of it, the sheer authority of Feather's writing.
Most people who work in Secret Service would leave a memoir that said, I knew what the people in this department were doing, and, we saw them at work, and I met them in the canteen, but we had no idea what they're up to. No, he doesn't leave any gaps like that. He knows everything. He knew everybody, and he was present at every event.
But before the memoirs can be published, Nick needs to verify them. No easy task, but he digs in. And soon, Nick finds himself caught in a web that almost 40 years later, he still hasn't totally escaped from.
What if your partner developed 21 new identities, or you discovered that your friend who helped you through your darkest times was actually a conniving con artist? Or what if you began seeing demons everywhere inhabiting people, including your son? What would you do? Stay tuned to the end of this episode to hear a preview of the newest season of This Is Actually Happening.
So, it's 1987. Nick Hiney is elbow deep in Feather's 3,000-page memoir, trying to verify what he can of Feather's vast, intimate knowledge.
I've gone here from assessing what we can cut out in order to publish it to thinking about the way that it was created.
Nick was dumbfounded that at the end of his life, when Feather sat down to write his memoirs, he remembered dialogue, names, dates. So Nick wonders if Feather referenced anything else to jog his memory while he was writing the memoirs.
So what could he have used to spur his memory? And in particular, I was interested in a book by a journalist called John Bullock called MI5. So I started to look at the text of MI5, and I immediately started to see passages that had been copied out.
Word for word?
Yes.
Passages copied out, word for word.
He takes turns of phrase, he takes descriptions, he takes events. Now, that's not too bad, because he might just be jogging his memory. But then there are examples where he takes passages from Bullock's book and he changes the dates in order to fit his own narrative. He's not simply using the text, but he's changing it. Now, I wrote to Bullock because I thought we'd better be clear about this. Did you have any contact with John Dancy?
Did you think that Dancy might be a source of Bullock?
That's quite possible, you see. So you've got to make sure that that wasn't the case. So I got in touch with Bullock, and he said no, he'd never heard of John Dancy.
Not only has this author never heard of Dancy, but Nick finds another book that Feather seems to have plagiarized. More passages copied out, more facts taken, then changed. And suddenly Nick is starting to doubt the veracity of everything in the memoirs.
I have all sorts of notes to myself about, is it possible to point to any single piece of uncorroborated evidence in the narrative and swear that it is true?
After months spent with the memoirs, Nick is outright angry at Feather. All these years later, he still has every document related to them, including all of the notes he wrote to himself. He pulls a page out of a file and reads it to us.
It says, Dancy was a conceited, methodical old bore with hang-ups related to violence, discipline, loyalty, and honor. comes out of my reading of the manuscript, trying to understand the man behind it and finding a very strange character. So obviously I was not happy in his company.
And so now the question is whether he can even move forward with the project.
I didn't feel that I could be involved because I couldn't trust the document, and I could not imagine a process where you could edit it. It would be like a butcher carving rotten bits off a piece of meat and selling it to the public. It's not something you can readily do.
After Nick had spent many months working on this project, what started out as potentially the most thrilling discovery in his young career ended in disappointment. Nick holds back his vitriol and submits a sober, unemotional assessment of the memoirs to his colleagues on the book project. He writes,
I've been reading through the First World War sections of John Dance's manuscript with a view to estimating their suitability for publication. I've read them very carefully and have reluctantly come to the opinion that they're too unreliable to be published. So this is a very careful document.
It reminds me of an MP's resignation letter.
Yes, I was going to spend more time with my family after this. But it had to be written so carefully because it was heretical to write this.
Why? Why was that heretical?
Because the publishing process was pretty far advanced.
I went back to Nick on this question after our interview because it was such strong language. Why was it heretical to say these things? He said, so many people were so invested in it. Faith had captivated all of them. They all wanted it to be true, just like Nick had for so long. Now he was telling them that their excitement about the memoirs, everything they'd wanted to believe about them, was wrong. Nick laid out the facts, and they were undeniable. And so the book project ground to a halt. It would never be published. But the BBC went forward with the documentary. We asked them why, but they declined to comment, saying it happened too long ago. Strangely, as you heard above, Nick agreed to be in it.
This is 4 months after you write this letter.
That's right, yes.
Saying that you think this is all gobbledygook and you don't really want to be involved anymore.
I don't think those are my exact words.
Sorry, I'm paraphrasing lightly.
Well, I have to say, knowing that you were the one who discovered the plagiarism, watching the documentary, it seems like you're lending your credibility to the text.
Yes, that's true. But looking back, I went too far, but then the alternative was just pulling out, which didn't seem... I don't identify with the strange young man in the jacket and tie in the documentary.
Looking back, something that Nick feels particularly uncomfortable about is the part of the memoir that deals with Father's murder training. Those scenes in the documentary about the butchery class, learning the precise way to slit a person's throat. He's never found any evidence that supports that. So that scene that was recreated in the documentary, what does that seem like to you now, in hindsight?
Well, now in hindsight, knowing a lot more from the official documents, it is an invention based on fiction. It's a fantasy.
I couldn't help thinking that Nick was a kind of unwitting accomplice to a much larger pattern of deception than even he knew. I asked him if he saw it that way.
I think that's very true, yes. Did he fool us all? I think people were desperate to believe in this remarkable document. As always, the advantages of believing are so enormous and outweigh the penalties of disbelieving that you're kind of drawn towards believing them.
What are the advantages of believing this?
You make television programs and publish books.
I see what Nick is saying here, that there was some tangible benefit to believing in these memoirs, and giving up that belief meant that all the work these academics did would have been basically for nothing. But I think there's something else going on too. Another advantage to believing in this. That if you start to question your beliefs, if you start to consider that you might have been wrong about something you believe so strongly, you start to question your own judgment, your own confidence in what's real and what's not. And those doubts are much scarier, I think, than losing a work project. There's loads of reasons you'd want to avoid a feeling like that. Anyway, Nick thought he'd put this whole ordeal behind him. He took all of his research, stacks of annotated pages of Feather's largely fictitious memoir, and put them into deep storage, presumably never to be looked at again. Until, a decade later, Nick learned something that makes him reconsider whether Feather's account was a total lie. Here's what happened. In 1997, the British government decides to declassify a huge number of documents related to their spy agencies, and they release them to the public. And as Nick reads the documents closely, certain details start to stick out to him. Details that make him wonder about Feather's memoir.
Some of Dance's descriptions of individuals are very accurate in terms of agreeing with the sources that we now have.
But didn't at the time.
But didn't at the time.
These newly declassified documents, they reveal that Feather knew things at the time that he couldn't have known without being an insider. Little inconsequential things. For example, he knew that the nickname of a certain high-ranking spy in the office was Stan, even though the man's name was Fred.
Dancy says he was Stan in the office. That's something nobody could have known in the 1970s unless they had some personal experience. It's a little detail, but there are other small details like that.
And he knew the identity of a shadowy senior operator that Nick says historians had entirely missed.
We hadn't spotted him, but he's very prominent in Dancy's manuscript.
And these details, they leave Nick confused about who Feather really was and how much he can completely reject his account.
It does appear that he had some involvement. And there were many, many people who were peripherally involved with MI5.
Nick wonders if Feather may have been a kind of trusted collaborator. There were hundreds of these, he says. People who were well connected, went to the right universities, belonged to the right clubs. As a doctor, Feather may have fit this description.
Then it becomes very difficult to know what to do. And I'm still stuck with that problem. I would love, in something that I'm writing at the moment, to be able to quote some of Dancy's opinions of particular MI5 officers whom he seems to have met. But how can you do that if you distrust the document?
What does that feel like, to feel still tethered to this document somehow intellectually all this time later?
It would have been convenient if I'd never seen it.
I know exactly how Nick feels. Once you're inside Feather's world, it's like being stuck in a hall of mirrors you can't get out of. You can't tell what's real and what isn't, where the lies begin and where they end. We started with the question, what kind of man was John Dancy? Our first answer was an international spy, trained to live a double life, to get in and out of buildings without being noticed, to slit someone's throat with a straight razor. Pretty grim. Definitely someone who'd be capable of pulling off a double murder. But it turns out that answer isn't exactly true. Our second answer, the real one, is that he was a wildly extravagant and successful liar. A fantasist even, who may have had something to do with spying, but only pretended to be trained in murder. Is that kind of person capable of killing two people?
I'm about to play a clip from This Is Actually Happening. Follow This Is Actually Happening on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
In my wife's system, she described it as like a big house. Everybody had rooms, and then they had a common room. Everybody had their own space, and they could come and commingle together in the common space. She described it as if she was an observer, like the person that walked around was like the host. That's what she called it, the host, because it didn't have a name. It was just like a vessel, like you put a key in an ignition and drive a vehicle. It was just a tool. So she was aware of the conversations, but she was never involved in them. So it would be like heated discussions between like Paisley, which was the 17-year-old, and she wanted to go on a date. She wanted to go flirt. And the mom part would be like, no, that's inappropriate. You're married. And Paisley would be like, well, I'm a 17-year-old. I want to go have fun. So they would talk with one another. And sometimes she would tell me that she'd just be sitting there and they would be having conversations. Blaze was the part that was in charge of finances. She was pretty much always out. Paisley was always out. Sophie was always out. But the only one that I never saw interact with anyone else was the decimator, which was the male part, which was pictured as like an abomination, as like a creature. That one I never saw interact with anyone other than me.
You can listen to This Is Actually Happening early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts.
Despite the plagiarism in the memoirs, the Dancy family was upset when they didn't get published. Faither's son wrote letter after letter begging Nick to reconsider, to publish the memoirs as a work of semi-fiction. A bit like Nick's academic colleagues, he so badly wanted Faither's story to be true that he couldn't fathom that it wasn't. And it seems to me, from my conversations with Mark Dancy, Faither's grandson and the present-day holder of the memoirs, that that's where he still is.
I felt at the time that it all ought to be published, really. And we discussed whether to publish it, perhaps a bit edited, but basically his version. Make it plain that its provenance was a little uncertain. But the academics wouldn't do the work, basically, because they were worried for their reputations.
Mark knows that Faither made things up, but he sees the fabrications as harmless exaggerations, almost a charming eccentricity.
It's this sort of completely, pretty much unnecessary sort of little deception that he gloried in. He absolutely loved it.
Why?
That was his mind, you know. You know, he loved putting one over people. I think he gloried in a deception well executed.
And Mark sees this whole attempt to make head or tail of Faither's stories as something that would have really tickled the man.
That's the way Faither worked, in a sense, you know. He'd be delighted to think that people couldn't decide either way about it. He sort of liked to sow uncertainty. Extraordinary man.
I mean, it leaves you with a sort of sense of frustration.
Yes, but I can see Faither laughing in heaven, if you see what I mean. You'd have been laughing at all the effort that has gone in to try and unravel all this, and that nobody can be quite sure.
Yes.
It was a bit awkward to be sitting with Mark while he was relishing Faither's love of deception. At the time of this conversation, I was still in the middle of reporting the night of the murder, still speaking with detectives and trying to understand. I wasn't totally clear on how I felt about all this, so I hadn't yet shared any of my reporting with Mark. But in this moment, I was distinctly aware that while Mark was saying one thing, I was hearing something else.
On whatever level you take what he wrote, it shows a certain brilliance. Well, if it was a deception, it shows a rare talent in deceit.
Mark's theory is that Faither just lied for the sport of it. But later in our conversation, Mark said something that sounded to me like a more likely motivation, psychologically speaking.
You know, he arrived home without a particular job to go to, I think, and Naomi was still struggling along doing her work.
We were talking about Feyther coming home from World War I, and like thousands of veterans at the time, he couldn't find steady work.
And he had to try and pick up the pieces and found it extremely hard going, I think. And he was a sort of second-class citizen, I think, to a certain extent, because she was the breadwinner.
What do you mean a second-class citizen?
Well, because he wasn't bringing anything into the family, requiring a wife who was working really hard to support him. And Naomi, I don't know how sort of solicitous Naomi would have been. She comes across to me as being pretty hard.
Hard in what way?
Well, I think she's so focused on her work, and the fact that she's doing things which women hadn't done before, that she may have resented the fact that she had to go home after a hard day's work and look after someone who was a pale shadow of his former self. And, someone of his sort would have found it very difficult to handle a sort of loss of status, maybe. Men were men in those days.
So, maybe, and to be clear, this is my theory and not Mark's, maybe Feyther told all these grandiose lies because he was ashamed of the reality of his life. Maybe his memoir is just an attempt to pass on a much more heroic story to his kids and grandkids. But that lie meant there were other stories he didn't tell. Don't you think it's strange that when he sits down to write the story of his life, he makes no mention of the fact that his wife was murdered in the family home? Naomi is mostly absent from the story Feyther tells. When she does appear near the end, one of the main things we learn is that she was a stickler about lying. Feyther tells us Naomi is the reason he left the spy service. She didn't approve of it and wouldn't marry him unless he gave it up. Feyther writes that Naomi had, quote, read somewhere that every successful spy had to be a murderer at heart. So he blames the end of this potentially fictional career on his very real wife? That's kind of it. In the story Feyther passes on to generations of Dancies, he essentially erases Naomi's legacy. And that's got to have some effect on the family.
Again, going back to the family legend, Feyther is this domineering, intellectually powerful adventurer. Naomi wasn't present.
Here's my brother-in-law Hugh again. Naomi's absence from the family's history came up during one of our occasional conversations about the project.
I mean, putting aside any kind of mystery about her death, it's just that story of great female accomplishment didn't exist in that form.
And with Naomi gone, what remained, Hugh thought, was explicitly male.
I mean, I grew up with this strong sense of a through line from Feyther to Grandad in particular, something that was handed down, but also kind of with a great big shove of drive and achievement, male intellectual achievement. That felt like an absolute thing.
The thing I've been asking myself is, did Feyther intend to erase Naomi? Is that why he wrote the memoir the way he did? And it seems like, in the backdrop of this whole conversation with Mark, about Feyther's love of deception, about his prolific lying and his bruised ego, is a question. Do these things add up to a kind of motive?
I mean, the thing that's difficult for me to fathom is whether he worried at all or whether he hurt anybody in the process. The question arises as to whether he was ever violent.
And then, it was like Mark read my mind.
You don't get the feeling that his tendency to like deceiving people would ever have a violent outcome, if you see what I mean. And obviously I'm sort of alluding here to Naomi and all that.
What do you mean?
Well, we've established that he had this tendency to deceive, which makes him a deviant of a sort, because most people don't behave like that. And the question is whether his deviance was sufficient to make him kill, which I don't believe.
After leaving Mark that day, my concern about how this project might affect him only got stronger, and he made his feelings more and more clear to me.
If you come out with a piece that says, he was a murderer, then I will be sorry that we ever said we would contribute to it.
Frankly, I was pretty terrified to fill Mark in on what I'd been learning. I put off having that conversation with him for as long as I could. Which was good, because in the meantime, months after this first interview with Mark, the family found something. A large brown envelope buried beneath a pile of old papers. Inside that envelope was a stack of letters written by Feyther in the years just before and after Naomi's murder. And Mark was convinced they would change my mind about Feyther. Next time on Ghost Story, we dive into the letters and we sit down with a woman who first received them more than 80 years ago. A woman who knew both Feyther and Naomi intimately, who can weigh in on their relationship in a way that no one else can.
My dad would never have killed my mom. He loved her.
Follow Ghost Story on the Wondery app, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at wondery.com/survey. Ghost Story is a production of Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios. It's hosted by me, Tristan Redman. Our lead producer is Annie Brown. Our senior producers are Chloe Prasinos and Jess Hackle. Our producers are Zandra Ellen and Emerald O'Brien, and our associate producer is Natalie Peart. Joel Lovell is our editor, with fact-checking by Maximo Anderson. Theme song and music by Daryl Griffith, supplied by APM Music, with mixing and original music by Hannes Brown. Pineapple's head of sound and engineering is Raj Makija, with assistant engineers Sharon Badales and Jade Brooks. The senior audio engineer for Ghost Story is Davey Sumner. Jess Hackle was our senior producer of development. Our artwork was designed by Brian Kluge. Legal services for Pineapple Street by Rachel Strom and Sam Kate Gumpert from Davis Wright Tremaine, Crystal Tupia at Odyssey, and David Hurst from 5RB. Our senior producer for Wondery is Michelle Martin, with producers Brian Taylor White and Grant Rutter. Rachel Sibley is the managing producer for Wondery, and Sarah Mathis is the coordinating producer. Our executive producers at Pineapple Street are Maddie Sprung-Kaiser, Max Linsky, and Jenna Weiss-Berman. Our executive producers for Wondery are Morgan Jones, Rich Knight, Marshall Louis, and Jessica Radburn. And special thanks to Calder Walton, Carol Sennett, Matthew Lockwood, Alison Vermeulen, and Barney Lee. This episode contains public sector information licensed under the Open Government License version 3.0.